Okay.
Good morning, everybody. A freilich in Hanukkah, a lichtikin, a lustig in Hanukkah. Every year I try to remind people that Hanukkah is much more complex than you learned about it as a child. And unfortunately, most people are still walking around with a children's image and understanding of what Hanukkah is all about. So we have a two-part presentation, highly condensed. When I used to teach the Hanukkah story at Stern College many years ago, it took me about 3 months to tell the story properly. So we will try to condense that into two sessions. Hanukkah, most people's understanding of Hanukkah is based on a very, very small passage in the Talmud. It's the only passage that deals with it at all. And it's a quotation from an earlier sefer called Megillas Tanis, which records events that took place during the Bayis Sheni. And all it says is on the 25th day of Kislev, the Jews overcame the Greeks, and they went back into the temple, and they found one cruse of oil, which lasted miraculously for 8 days. And therefore, we celebrate Hanukkah. That's it. That's the whole discussion. There are other hints at what went on elsewhere in the Talmud, but that's basically the story of Hanukkah. And that's what most people understand it as. The truth is much more complicated. Hanukkah is not so much a victory of the Jews over the Syrian Greeks, but in all honesty, it was really a civil war. Hanukkah is a victory of Torah-observant Jews over those secular Hellenizing Jews. And that's what it's all about. And I want to give the background to that because it's very, very important to understand, because many Jews, including the aristocracy and the Kohanim who actually worked in the Beis HaMikdash, became secular Hellenists, and the sources, and this is something that's very important. Most rabbis don't study Jewish history. It's unfortunate. There are contemporary accounts of what took place that are not part of our quote-unquote sacred literature, which are somehow neglected, and that's unfortunate. There are 24 books in Tanakh. At the time when the rabbis codified which books will be included in Tanakh, there were many, many other books in circulation that were being read, which were not included for a variety of reasons. Gemara Bava Basra, Daf Yud Daled, and Tesvav, which talks about which books were included in Tanakh and why. However, among the books that were not canonized are the books of the Chashmonaim, a book of Maccabees, or truly, the real name, they shouldn't be referred to as Maccabees, they're Chashmonaim. And we may get to that on Friday, where the word Maccabee came from. But they were Chashmonaim, from the family of Kohanim. Chashmon was a name of a place where they lived. Matisyahu was a Kohen. He was not a Kohen Gadol, as far as we know, even though it says so in Al Hanisim. But the books of the Maccabees, there are 4 books. The first 2 are eyewitness accounts of what took place in the period before, during, and right after the story of Hanukkah took place. The book of Maccabees is very crucial to understanding what happened, what really happened. That's number 1. It's a very important source. You can Google it. You can get it in the library. It's part of what they call the Sforim Chitzoniyim, the apocryphal literature. The first 2 of the 4 books are the most historically accurate. Another very important primary source is Josephus. Josephus wrote in Greek. It's been translated to English by a number of different sources. And Josephus was a 1st century historian, lived during the time of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and he writes about the history of the Jews. And he also includes many things taken from Greek historians as well as from the Sefer Chashmonaim. So it's very important to read those 2 sources, among other midrashim that I'm going to quote. Understand the story of Hanukkah. It's not the way most people understand it. It all begins with Alexander the Great, actually his father, Philip of Macedon. Macedonia was the country that became Greece. And Philip of Macedon was a wonderful king, and he conquered many lands. His son Alexander took over after him. Alexander was a very unusual monarch. He was what the model for what they call a philosopher king. As a young man, he studied under Aristotle. So he was a very intelligent individual, also very good to the Jews, which is why so many Jews are named Alexander, my late father included. There are even Alexander Hasidim. So you don't name a person after somebody who was not good to the Jews. In any event, Alexander was called Alexander the great conqueror, because he conquered many, many, many lands. During his time, he conquered most of Europe and parts of Asia and the Mediterranean. He had a huge, huge kingdom. Unfortunately, Alexander the Great died young. He died when he was 30 years old, and none of those who succeeded him were able to control this huge empire that he had. They divided up among his generals. In Greek, that's called a diadochi. They divided up among his generals, and they were not very good at running his empire. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But what Alexander the Great believed in was Hellenization. Hellenization means every country you absorb has to become Greek in every way. The word Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. Hellenization is when you absorb the culture of the country you conquered, and they become Greek in every way. They speak Greek, they dress Greek, they have Greek names. Alexander was known to conduct mass weddings when his soldiers and officers were married to local women. And of course, that the expression in Megillah Esther, "Umedaber kilshon amo," when you get married, you speak the language of your husband in the ancient world. And they began speaking Greek, and they became Greek citizens. That's how you voted. If you weren't a Greek citizen, you had no say in how the government was running. This was the model of Alexander the Great, and his generals kept it up. Every country they conquered had to become Greek in every way. The Jews were given occasional dispensations. In other words, they had a city-state, a polis. Every Greek country has individually governed city-states. There's another category called an ethnos. An ethnos means you were allowed to live according to your own religious values. He was very tolerant in that regard for the Jews, not to anybody else. You had to put the Greek gods in your temple. You had to worship the Greek gods. The Jews were left alone. Okay. The generals, the diadochi, were not very good administrators. They were generals. They were not leaders like Alexander was. And the huge empire kind of collapsed. And what was left was basically Egypt and Syria was left of Alexander the Great's huge, huge empire. The Egyptian area was ruled by the family of the Ptolemies, a whole group of generals named Ptolemy, first, second, third, fourth, etc. The area above in the north in Syria was ruled by the Seleucidian family, Seleucus. And Antiochus was from the Seleucus family. And now what's in between Egypt and Syria? Israel. And they were constantly fighting over control of Israel. And Israel's biggest problem was, who should they support during the battle? The Seleucidians or the Ptolemies? And it's interesting that the grandfather of the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story, Antiochus III, was fighting with Ptolemy over Israel, and the Jews in Israel sided with Antiochus III. When the Syrian Greeks won over the Egyptian Greeks, he granted tax exemptions to all the Jews. He gave special rights to the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. He passed a decree, he didn't allow pig in Yerushalayim. I mean, he was very, very good to the Jews. And Josephus records all of the wonderful decrees that Antiochus III gave to the Jews. The Ptolemies, by the way, had their own greatness. Ptolemy II was known to have a huge library in Alexandria. And he gathered the classics of antiquity and translated them to Greek. What was the one book he didn't have? Tanakh. So he did an interesting thing, and the Gemara Megillah records this actual happening, where Ptolemy II gathered the 72 members of the Sanhedrin, and he brings them to this island in the middle of the Nile, puts them up in a hotel. Every member of the Sanhedrin had his own private room, and he asked every one of them to write a translation of the Tanakh into Greek. And as you know, you can't take the Torah literally. You have to explain certain things. You have to change the meaning around in order to fit the words, because the words sometimes imply something different than the way it's translated. In any event, all 72 translators came up with an identical translation, which was a very miraculous type of thing. On the one hand, Chazal weren't happy that Torah was now available in Greek. On the other hand, it was a nace that all the translations came out the same. Okay, back to our story. So, Seleucus III, Antiochus III's son was Seleucus II. Names aren't important. Antiochus IV, our Antiochus of the Hanukkah story, becomes the emperor of Syria, or the governor of Syria, actually, and including the Jews that were located in Judea, in between Syria and Egypt. The fighting is still going on, but right now, at this particular point in time, we're talking roughly 175 BCE is when we're talking about. The Greeks in Syria, under Antiochus IV, ruled Judea. The Jews, unfortunately, were subject to his rule. And again, like all the generals before him and all the kings before him, he embarked on a campaign to Hellenize all the Jews. He did not believe, as his ancestors did, that the Jews could have their own ethnos, their own self-governing state, according to their own rules. He wanted them to be Greeks. Many Jews living in Israel agreed with him. And they figured the way to get a better job in the government is to become like the Greeks, to speak Greek, to dress like Greeks, to behave like Greeks, and that they did that. And we can spend a lot of time on the Beis HaMikdash, because the Beis HaMikdash, unfortunately, was ruled by an aristocratic group of Kohanim who wanted to advance and get in a more positive way with the ruling authorities, to the point that they bribed Antiochus and the other officials of Syria, to appoint different people to become a Kohen Gadol in the Beis HaMikdash. It became a political appointee job. It was no longer through the yichus, through the what's the word for you? The lineage of who was supposed to be the Kohen Gadol. And they became very assimilated. And this is a very painful story to recall, that the Kohanim who served in the Beis HaMikdash were among the biggest Hellenists. They assimilated, for example. And this is a very painful story that is recorded in Sefer Chashmonaim. Part of Greek culture is athletics, the Olympics. And then part of their Avodah Zarah meant you performed these athletic events, the discus throwing and the javelin throwing and the wrestling. You did this naked in the arena, wearing this special hat called the patassos, which was part of their Avodah Zarah. But all the events in the Greek culture, the athletic events were performed in the nude. This could be problematic for Jews who wanted to become assimilated Greeks, because every Jew had a bris milah, and it would become very obvious that you're Jewish, and it's very hard to hide a circumcision, except the Kohanim, not the average Jew, but the Kohanim who want to participate in these athletic events underwent painful surgery to hide the fact they were circumcised. I can't even imagine. And They did their avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, as such as it was, and then they took off their clothes and went to the arena to perform in the athletic events. This was a situation roughly around 170 BCE, and it got worse. And by the way, Antiochus was not a normal person. Antiochus he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Magnificent. All the people, however, called him Antiochus Epimanes, the Meshuggah one, because he did very strange, aberrant behavior. He would go in the streets and give out candies and coins to throw it in the street to people. But to his officers, he'd give them stones instead of pennies or gold pieces. He was a very strange guy. He used to get a big kick out of tripping up people in the bathhouse. He was not normal. However, he allowed himself to be manipulated by some of his officers, and they pushed this Hellenism very, very strong. His generals enforced some of his decrees. Now, it's interesting that the non-Jews know very well what are the basics of Judaism. And in order to get the Jews to become Hellenists, he outlawed circumcision. He outlawed the observance of Shabbos. And he outlawed learning Torah. And a whole bunch of decrees that he issued in order to make the Jews become more like the Greeks. And part of this whole story of Antiochus, which is ignored, is that the Greek hierarchy was going down and Rome was now beginning its ascent. So Antiochus wanted to impress his Roman soon-to-be rulers that he was in control of Judea and everybody was a good Greek, except for the Jews. So he had to be very harsh in putting them down. In the meantime, there were traditional Jews who were very opposed to this secularization, to this assimilation. Okay? Matisyahu was a Kohen. He had 5 sons. Interestingly enough, each of his 5 sons had a physical deformity that prohibited them from serving in the Beis Hamikdash. Interesting. It's a fascinating footnote that most people aren't aware of. One had his eyebrows were too bushy. One had a club foot. Another one each one had a different physical deformity, which prohibited them from serving in the Beis Hamikdash. A Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash had to be perfect. Yehuda was a makban, according to Mishnah Bechoros. A makban is a macrocephalic, where your forehead protrudes and the back of your head sticks out. He was Yehuda HaMakban, which was a mallet head, a hammerhead. Not the great warrior, the great hammerer. He looked like a mallet, like a hammer. Interestingly, it's spelled in Greek. It's a kappa, which in Hebrew becomes a kuf. So Makban was spelled Mem Kuf Bet Nun. Makban. Somehow along in the various copying of all these various manuscripts, the Nun became truncated to a Yud, Maccabi. And then the Kuf became a Chaf. Again, it's all over a period of time. In any event, things got so bad in terms of assimilating the Jews to become Greeks that they actually went ahead and made the Beis Hamikdash into a Greek temple of Avodah Zarah. And that was the last straw. When they brought an idol into the Beis Hamikdash and they began sacrificing pigs in the Beis Hamikdash, Matisyahu and his fellow Kohanim said, Genuk, Adkan, no more. And the year 167 BCE, they departed Jerusalem. They left Jerusalem and began the revolt against the Syrian Greeks. The farmers, the scribes, they were not soldiers. So they waged what essentially is a guerrilla war against the Syrian army. They attacked them at night. They attacked them when they were sleeping in their tents. They lured them into narrow passageways. And they had victory after victory. They had some terrible losses too. And interesting halachos emerged from this. There was one period of time when it was a Shabbos, so they all hid in a cave because they wouldn't fight on Shabbos. And the Greeks found them, and they built a fire, and then they killed them all with smoke. There was a big battle. And at that point, the Chachamim said, we have to modify the halacha that if you are engaged in a battle for your life, you obviously can fight on Shabbos. And that halacha became, and that is the halacha today. And they suffered terrible losses. Elazar, one of the Matisyahu's sons, was crushed by an elephant. If in your shul, by the way, you have any of the old Birnbaum Sidurim, in the back of the Birnbaum Sidurim, there is a little section known as Megillat Antiochus, which is a medieval compilation which it tells the story that I'm telling you now in a truncated version with pieces borrowed from Josephus and the Book of Maccabees. It's not the greatest historical document, but it's available if you have the Birnbaum Siddur. It gives you a little background into the wars and the fighting between the Syrian Greeks and the Jews. But essentially, this was a civil war because not only were they fighting against the Greeks, or the Syrian Greeks in Jerusalem, but they were fighting against their assimilated countrymen. And that was the civil war aspect, because the Jews that wanted better civil service jobs wanted to assimilate, wanted to become part of Greek culture. And they joined with the Syrians fighting against their fellow Jews. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And the battle went on for 2 years. The battle went on for 2 years, from 167 BCE until 165 BCE. And it's no accident that they brought this temple, the pig, into the temple on Chaf Hei Kislev of 167 BCE, which is 2 years earlier than when they rededicated the Beis HaMikdash. And we'll talk more about that later. When they actually were able to rededicate the Beis HaMikdash, they did it on the exact same day to memorialize that particular date in history. So you have this battle, civil war, as well as the war against the army. And because they were outnumbered and out-weaponized, they had to be very clever in their battle. Ultimately, the Hashmonaim and the fellow Kohanim and the farmers who left Jerusalem were victorious. They were victorious. In the fall of 165 BCE was when they had their final battles. And what holiday occurs in the fall after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Sukkot. And they were unable to observe Sukkot in the Beis HaMikdash because they were out in the hills and the mountains fighting against the Syrian Greeks. They finally won. They kicked them out. And it's a fascinating story recorded in the Midrash Psikta Rabbasi, and it's referred to several times in the Gemara in other contexts, but it's referred to. And of course, the Sefer Hashmonaim talks about it in great detail. The last battle was to reconquer Jerusalem and gain control of the Beis HaMikdash. And you have this huge army coming up Harabayas. And there were 8 Syrian Greek soldiers manning the wall of the Beis HaMikdash. They see this throng of humanity coming up the hill. They drop their 8 spears and they left. The first group comes up. They find these 8 spears. They lop off the tops. They make it into victory torches, and they wave the torches to the people below, similar to the 6-day war. Hakotel biyadenu. We now have control of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? That was 165 BCE, towards the end of the month of Mar Cheshvan. So it's a month before Kislev. Because you have to understand, They didn't clean the polluted Beis Hamikdash in one day. It took them over a month to get rid of everything, because once the kalim are polluted, you can't re-kadoshify them, so to speak. You have to make new kalim, everything from scratch, clean out all the garbage, get rid of the sacred prostitution areas that they had in the Beis Hamikdash. Tremendous job. It took them about a month. Meantime, they took these 8 spears. Remember the number, 8. They took the 8 spears, and the first menorah in the reconstituted Beis Hamikdash was made from these 8 spears. Shmona shpudim shel barzel. That was the first menorah in the new Beis Hamikdash. Then they covered it with bronze, and then they covered it with silver, and ultimately with gold. But that was the first menorah after they beat the Syrian Greeks. Shmona shpudim shel barzel. This story, for some reason, is not told. I don't know why. Yeah.
If it took a month to clean the Beis Hamikdash, they had a lot of time to get oil.
Yes.
So how does that fit with the story that we're told?
As I said in the beginning, most people walk around with a 5-year-old's understanding of Hanukkah. First of all, the rabbis were troubled by this question also. The Beis Halevi suggests that maybe they cut the wicks into eighths, and that's why it lasted 8 days. But the 8 days has more to do. And I said to you, they were fighting it in the hills during Mar Cheshvan. They weren't able to celebrate Sukkot. When they were finally able to clean up the Beis Hamikdash and rededicate it, the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot, with lulav and esrog, with karbonos. It was a tashlumin. It was a makeup for the Sukkot they couldn't celebrate while they were fighting against the Syrian Greeks.
Which is one of the explanations from one of the Rabbi Yosse's is why we go from 1 to 8, because of the karbonos.
Beis Shammai. Shammai is of the opinion that we should light the menorah in descending order to correspond to the Sukkot sacrifices. The Gemara says that.
Started with many.
But people don't make the connection because they haven't read Sefer Chashmonaim. Okay? We will talk more on Friday in part 2 of why Hanukkah is 8 days. We already have 2 reasons right now. The 8 spears that became the first menorah, and the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot, which is 8 days long. I'll go one step further, and I'll end with this, but it's like a teaser, but we'll continue with this on Friday. Josephus describes how was the second Hanukkah celebrated. The first Hanukkah, I understand, Tashlumin for Sukkot. How was the second Hanukkah celebrated and successive celebrations? So he says, and it's recorded also in Sefer Chashmonaim, that there were torchlight parades throughout Jerusalem. Yeah, torches before the 8 torches that they found, 8 spears that became torches. They celebrated with torchlight parades throughout the streets of Jerusalem with lulavim and esrogim and hadassim and aravos for many years. Now, in between the Romans and the Greeks, there was a group that ruled Judea known as the Parthians. They were a Persian group that worshipped the Zoroastrian fire god. And Rashi refers to this in the Gemara in Shabbos Chaf Aleph. And he says that they had a rule that during their holiday, which is the winter solstice, which roughly corresponds to Hanukkah, no public fires could be burning except in their temples. So you couldn't have torchlight parades to celebrate Hanukkah. So what happened? The public celebration now became a private celebration. It moved indoors, and that's where your Chanukiah was born. The Chanukiah was born because you could no longer have public torchlight parades. The Lulav and Esrog kind of disappeared. However, some Yemenite families still hang Hadassim on their walls on Hanukkah. And as I mentioned in my article, the link last week, on a visit to the Kotel tunnels many, many years ago during Hanukkah, there's a section that's very as close as you could get to where the Kodesh Kodashim used to be. There's a small Oren Kodesh still keeps it alive. All right, so this is a little taste of the background of Hanukkah, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on Friday in terms of the menorah, etc., and a few more interesting things about the Chashmonaim and how the Hanukkah observance came to be what it is today. So if you have a chance between now and Friday, I urge you, look at Josephus, look the first two books of the Maccabees. It'll give you a whole different appreciation of the historical background of Hanukkah. And I think it's important that we as adults understand it a little bit differently than when we were 5-year-olds and we learned the story about the oil lasting for 8 days. And there's a wonderful sefer called My Hanukkah, written about 200 years ago, which gives over, it's called Ner Lameya. It gives 100 different reasons why Hanukkah had to be 8 days. And then more recently, a book came out in Israel, which lists a couple of hundred more reasons why it had to be 8 days. We'll talk a little bit more about that on Friday. So enjoy the rest of Hanukkah. Stay warm. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Take care, Wally.
Thank you, Wally. Have a good Hanukkah.
A good Hanukkah, everybody.
Have a good Hanukkah. Have a
Oh,
great
man,
day.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Plenty of latkes.
Answer